talk will be given by Frank Wattenberg. It'll be on the modeling of and for high stakes controversial decisions for a better world.
So welcome everybody. I'm glad to see you, or even if it's just virtual. This is going to be a very ambitious talk. So I hope you'll interrupt with questions, and as things come up, don't hesitate to unmute and ask a question. This picture is kind of a metaphor for our talk. Our eyes have three kinds of sensors that sense color. One of the sensors senses red, one senses green, and one senses blue. And individually, the sensors give us the pictures that we see in the two upper corners, upper left, upper right, and at the bottom, where you see red, you see blue, and you see green. You really don't get a good picture of our world unless you combine all three. And that's what you see in the center, where you're seeing a mixture of red, green, and blue. And that's kind of a metaphor for this talk, because I'm going to argue that we need the arts, the humanities, and the sciences. Each one of those contributes a part of our understanding. But we need all three of them together, and we need them in particular to make better decisions. So I mentioned this is an ambitious talk. My goal is to really help our students make a better world. And in order to make a better world, we have to be able to make better decisions. So I'm really talking about situations like this, really high stakes, controversial situations. For example, what should we do in Gaza? What should we do in the United States? So that's what we're interested in. We're interested in really high stakes, controversial decisions. Um, and the center of this talk is what we as mathematicians call modeling, and what scientists call the scientific method, and what perhaps is more common in the general vernacular is narrative. So as mathematicians, we build mathematical models. As scientists, we build scientific theories, and we often construct more informally a narrative. That's a story that weaves together all the facts and kind of places them in context. So the essence of all three of those is a constant interplay between the real world and our model, theory, or narrative. So I'm going to focus on that interplay. And as they say, the big question here is we go back and forth between the real world and our model, our theory, or our narrative. We build our whatever it is narrative on the basis of the real world. Then we analyze and we look at what the implications are of that model or narrative. And then we return to the real world and we compare it. And we're always challenging. We're always going back and forth. So that's the important picture. So when we're dealing with really crucial issues, the kinds that we're talking about, the first thing we need to do is we need to look at the stakeholders or the actors. And that's the core of decision makers, of decision making. These are the people who will be impacted by the decisions they make, and these are the people whose actions are going to determine the results of those decisions. So understanding the stakeholders, a deep, visceral understanding, that's the province of the arts. So I'm talking about the visual arts, I'm talking about the verbal arts, I'm talking about music. The arts really gives us that deep, often cross-cultural understanding we need. The second big issue is values, cultures, and norms. Now, in a typical textbook problem, there's something you're trying to maximize, there's something you're trying to minimize. But in the real world, we often have multiple, often conflicting criteria for success. So balancing and choosing among those criteria, that's the province of the humanities. So we desperately need to make humanities as well. And finally, not finally, because we're scientists, scientists are crucial to decision making in three ways. First of all, they inform decision making. So in order for us to understand the world in which we live, in order for us to understand the implications, the impact of our decisions, we need the sciences. And that's the informing job. The second thing the sciences do is they provide options. So often we can use the sciences to give us new options that maybe we didn't have before. And finally, and what I'm going to talk about a lot here, is using the sciences to understand both individual and group decision making. So this is a graphic that's meant to illustrate stakeholders, the actors. So what you see here, of course, is the Gaza Strip in context. And I just put 8 pictures up here, kind of almost, I could have chosen hundreds of pictures to indicate some of the stakeholders. And notice in the lower right-hand corner, there's a stork bringing a baby in 2035. So we need to think not only of current stakeholders, but we need to think of future stakeholders. So I'm going to focus on lots of classroom-ready materials and practices. And these are things that you can do tomorrow in your class. So this is first example of a classroom-ready material or practice. So I often have my students work in groups. I often have them work individually. Um, all of that's important. You and kind of what you do with these things depends on your own preferences. But I often have my students pick a particular high stakes controversial topic, and I ask them to develop a list of the stakeholders and actors. And then I ask them to find art that expresses or conveys a deep understanding of several of the stakeholder actors that they've identified. And they do that all individually. Maybe they do it overnight as homework between 2 class sessions. And then we come together in class, and in plenary session, the students present and compare the results of their work. So that's something you can do tomorrow. I mean, it doesn't take a lot of effort. It's one classroom day, maybe to set it up. At the end of one classroom day, some work overnight, and then you talk about it the next day in class. This one's more ambitious. You can do this at an institution-wide basis. So each year, your college or university or high school can pick a high-stakes controversial topic. Each museum and library can mount an exhibit with art conveying an understanding of some of the stakeholders and actors. The college or university can choose a short reading list of books that all students and faculty must read, invite a variety of speakers, and then each course spends time studying the impact of the various decisions on the stakeholders and actors. So together, the institution as a whole has, as I say, their institute-wide reading lists, speakers, that everybody can talk about that. And the idea is you do this institution-wide, and then in your classes, you talk about that. So one of the things we want to do when we do that is we want to build a framework and a vocabulary for high stakes decision making. And I just put one graphic up here to see some of the things that are involved. And a good example here is to think about something like your own personal security when you're choosing a password. And I've got 3 sets of dots here. The set of black dots going down the diagonal, that's your typical zero-sum situation. So there's some vocabulary, zero-sum, and the idea is there's a trade-off between security and convenience. The more complicated you make your password, um, the lower the convenience, but the higher the security. Vice versa, if you pick a really simple password, really convenient, but it's pretty easy to guess. I'm always surprised when I look at people who really should know better. And you look at the passwords, the pins they've got on their phones, and they're almost you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or you see the ones that go down the left diagonal and down the right diagonal. So people are choosing these very convenient things at the expense of security. So that's a typical example. We need to build up the idea of a zero-sum situation. The red dots are more interesting in a way. This is a situation where if you choose one extreme, it's really good for one person on one by one measure. Um, Choose another extreme, it's really good on the other measure. Anything in between is really bad for both people. So that's the worst kind of a situation. And if you're thinking about if you do differential equations, a really good example is two-species interaction, where you can have different kinds of interactions, where you can have a very aggressive interaction, where one species will tend to wipe out the other one. Um, or you can have what you see in the way of these blue dots, where you see the intermediate values are actually better for both people. So that's maybe kind of a symbiotic relationship. So we build up this vocabulary, this framework we have for dealing with these high stakes decisions. So here's something you can do institution-wide. So this requires obviously a lot of preparation. Maybe the faculty gets together over the summer or the year before, and our goal is to build up a framework of vocabulary for high stakes decision making. And before the first day, the faculty divide into 6 teams. Each team prepares a 1 hour lesson for all students. So, for example, one team is the arts, and they might prepare one session on using arts to build cross-cultural understanding. Now, different members of the team are going to do different things. For example, some faculty might use literature, others might use the visual arts. But the idea is on each team, each faculty member develops a 1 hour session on using the arts to build cross-cultural understanding. Then on the first day, every student goes to 6 1 hour sessions, one from each of these teams. And collectively, those 6 1 hour sessions work together to build a framework and a vocabulary for high stakes controversial decision making. Then during the academic year, all the courses can utilize that framework and that vocabulary. We set up that basis for talking, for dealing with these kinds of problems. So I'm going to look at one key topic that we can't ignore, and that's lying. So Kellyanne Conway is famous for saying alternative facts. And of course, alternative facts make no sense at all. I mean, facts are facts. Um, you know, some might be wrong, some might be right, but a fact presumably is grounded in something real. Um, on the other hand, the idea of an alternative narrative does make sense. So different people spin different stories. They look at things different ways. And that idea of an alternative narrative makes complete sense. And we're dealing with a situation now where there is a lot of deliberate lying going on. So we've got to recognize the fact that we live in that kind of environment and we've got to test these narratives. And I'm going to argue that we can use the scientific method to do that. So the next slide, this is the classroom ready materials and practices, and this is actually available on the CityOde website. It takes some preparation. So you actually have to get some equipment and have it ready. But this is a really nice, I think, example of how scientists use a scientific method to choose between two different alternative explanations. So the first one is called One Very Simple Hour in the Life of a Scientist, and it's based on color. And the story is, I mentioned that we have 3 kinds of color sensors, red, green, and blue. So one model of color is based on those 3 kinds of colors, red, green, and blue. And the nice thing about it is you can see it. And we begin with and so students have a set of gels that they can hold up to white light and they'll see red or they'll see green and they'll see blue. And the question is, how do those gels work? And there are 2 different alternative models. One model is called the painting model, and that says as you get red light, green light, and blue light coming in, the red light goes right through. The green light is actually painted red, and the blue light is also painted red. The other model is called the blocking model, and that says as you go through a red filter, a red gel, the red light gets through, but the green and blue is blocked. And those are 2 different models. And what we ask the students to do is design some experiment that lets them choose between the 2. And what you see there is an experiment that does it, and they can actually say, okay, we've got these 2 different competing models. We can design an experiment and we can determine which one's right. So it's exactly what we want them to do when they're talking about narratives, when they're talking about these other situations that have to do with high stakes kinds of decision making. That first example with red, green, and blue is nice, it's simple, it's very self-contained, and it's very, very satisfying. The second one deals with polarized light, and that's a much more complicated one. Much more like real life because students are going to go through that one and they're going to be left with more questions than answers. But it's the same thing. They're going to have to formulate different models. They're going to have to test those models and decide which one is right. So these, as I say, they're available from Simio now. It does require some preparation to get materials that you need to work with them. Okay, I mentioned that we're going to look at the science of thinking. And our goal is illustrated that visual up in the upper right corner, upper left corner, I'm sorry. And our purpose is to build understanding. We really want to understand what's going on in the world. And we're going to build up that understanding with three different kinds of thinking. The first thinking is what's called fast thinking, unconscious thinking, parallel thinking. I'm using the terminology developed by Daniel Kahneman in his book Thinking Fast and Slow. That's what happens kind of unconsciously. When you're in a situation, you're making lots and lots of observations. Your fast thinking is reflexive. It happens very, very fast. It's also what learning models do. The second kind of thinking is slow, conscious, linear. That's when we're reasoning things out. We're thinking about one thing at a time as opposed to lots of things at once. And those two work together. Our fast thinking might focus our attention on a particular thing that we'll then look at more consciously, more slowly. So the fast thinking impacts the slow thinking impacts the fast thinking. Those things are not independent of each other. And the third thing I put down at the bottom is narrative. So we kind of um, frame our facts in terms of an underlying story. And again, that's almost a third kind of thinking. So the thing I want to emphasize, I want to talk about now is this idea of narrative, and we come back to that scientific method in the lower right-hand corner where we want to build a narrative and test that narrative against the real world. Okay, so now we're getting classroom ready materials using a scientific method to study competing narratives. And again, um, we build narratives. Some of those lie. We create them, we extrapolate. The word that's used in artificial intelligence is hallucinate. And then we analyze them. We kind of understand what the implications are. We compare them with the real world. So the idea is to go back and forth and actually decide which of several competing narratives is maybe the better one. So again, you can do that in your classroom really easily. So the instructor picks a controversial topic with two or more different narratives. For example, the events of January 6th, 2021, or the actions of ICE during the first year of the second Trump administration. Each student is expected to articulate two different narratives. So students probably have one narrative that they're comfortable with, the narrative that they've essentially internalized, but they're going to have to express a competing narrative. And then each student develops a plan to challenge and test both narratives. The same way as scientists, we compare two different theories. And then they carry out their plan, and in plenary session, they discuss and compare the results. So this probably requires a couple of classroom hours with homework in between. So I mentioned earlier, Kahneman's talk about fast and slow thinking. Um, Slow thinking is conscious linear. The computer science term for that is design. So these are things like algorithms. The fast unconscious parallel thinking, the term that's used in the artificial intelligence world is linear. So that's things like ChatGPT. Um, and now I want to get to the final step just in time, and that's values. So I just put a bunch of different values that might be important: life, health, security, pursuit of happiness, diversity, equity, inclusion, you name it. And the idea is the humanities is the province of the value. That's where we talk about values, norms, culture. So we bring the humanities in, and we have to both talk about what the values are, and we have to make choices. Sometimes it's a question of balancing values. Sometimes you actually have to make a choice between one or the other. So classroom ready materials again. Each student picks a controversial decision, for example, limits on speech and on civil disobedience on a college campus. They articulate the relevant values, for example, security and freedom of expression and action. Each student looks for relevant work in the humanities. Each student looks for relevant for vocabulary in the humanities. For example, zero sum, moral hazard. And then again, you come together in plenary session, you present and compare the results of their work. So the last slide takes us back to the first slide. Our goal is better decisions for a better world. And you'll see my email address down at the bottom. And I'd love to talk to people about that. So just send some email and let's talk.